So we're providing the presentation today to challenge you to think about how you can reopen your buildings to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 and other contagious pathogens. We've just experienced not a natural disaster, but a biological disaster, and just like natural disasters, the effects, in this case, the risk can only be mitigated and not eliminated. So this is a discussion with you about your buildings or the buildings you manage and how to do that. The solutions require definitely a coordinated approach between building features and operational procedures. So again, we're challenging everyone to think about that. The presenters today are myself. I'm Rebecca Rand-Costigan. I'm Chief Engineer of Criterium Engineers. Criterium Engineers is a national engineering consulting firm providing engineering services for existing buildings and new construction with over 35 offices throughout the United States. I'm a licensed professional engineer, mechanical engineer, licensed in several states with over 20 years of experience in buildings and system engineering. I'm also concurrently an adjunct professor at the University of Maine in the Mechanical Engineering Technology Department as the lead HVAC design instructor. My co-presenter this morning is Alan Mooney. Alan is the founding president of Criterium Engineers. He is a civil structural engineer, also licensed in multiple states with a very impressive track record of construction-related issues, construction quality, building inspection procedures, and standards. Alan was the founding president of the National Academy of Building Inspection Engineers, and he is a very active advisor and consultant to the engineering staff at Criterium Engineers. We're all pretty adept at Zoom meetings at this point. However, to review the presentation protocol, we brought you into the meeting on mute. We encourage you to ask questions on the chat function, and we will try to get to some of the questions at the end of the presentation. If time doesn't allow us to address all the questions, we will follow up with you outside this meeting. Again, we'll address the questions over chat and will not be opening up the presentation to verbal questions. So with that, we will get started. So, managing your building in the coronavirus world is a new challenge, without a doubt. So what are your opportunities to coordinate sanitation practices with tenants and occupants, to provide social distancing solutions, to improve the air quality with dilution and filtration, and to communicate your good faith efforts to tenants and occupants. So where do you start? Every building is different. So where can you start? You can inventory your building. Has your building been completely closed? So are there special opening prevention measures you should consider? Because there may be limits on what you can do. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is more of a maintenance and ongoing. We aren't going to spend a lot of time talking about initial opening procedures. I will note there are a couple of very important items to consider on opening that have to do with flushing the air through the building, flushing the piping for the potable water systems to prevent bacteria from forming and being a problem for your occupants once they come into the building. And what affects your opportunities for your building? Age, types of windows, your heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system and its configuration. Depending on where you're located in the country, they could be very different with very similar buildings, and that would change your protocol. Tenant or occupant density and construction type and architectural features certainly will affect what you have for opportunities. So as we present these issues, I want to let everybody know Alan and I both have spent quite a bit of time in the past month or two participating in groups that are also talking about these issues, from the International Code Council to Energy Star to ASHRAE, and everyone is, there are lots of links about and opportunities to research what you can be doing. And these are very consistent with what all of these groups are talking about. And again, we challenge you to think of how this affects your specific building, because there are lots of ways to consider traffic flow to increase social distancing. The type of use of your spaces can affect how you encourage social distancing, from break rooms and lobbies and in and outdoors. Traffic density, again, a lot of those high traffic areas, making them one ways or providing directions. And identify the bottlenecks. So can you change your entrances to an in and an outdoor? Are there elevators that you want to limit capacity? Lobbies, again, one side in, one side out, and restrooms. So in general, can you close off your common areas where people can congregate? Can you modify the traffic flow in narrow corridors? Specifically, in Maine, we don't have a lot of high-rise buildings, so you can encourage the use of stairs to reduce elevator usage. Add signs to limit that elevator use to one person at a time. So as you develop and implement a plan, you want to define the social distancing, including the use of masks. Establish what the occupant density requirements are of each of your spaces. Provide signage and communicate plan with users. This, Alan, I don't know if you want to talk any about this. Alan also owns a commercial building which is preparing to have people come back into it. There are lots of opportunities to communicate, and that's a big part of the social distancing piece with buildings.
To jump in a little bit, Rebecca, on that, this is Alan, but yeah, I mean, I think the signage is particularly important. I mean, every program that we've seen, the essence of communicating with the occupants and how the building is going to be used, what the purpose is, and what the logic is, so that people understand what's trying to be accomplished, not aggressive, you must do kind of signage, but rather, these are the guidelines in order to keep us all safe. Folks that own the buildings, folks that are using the buildings, and even kind of making it interesting when you had the slide there about encouraging the use of stairs instead of elevators. I mean, like we did once with our building in Portland when we had an elevator failure and had the elevator shut down for several weeks. We made it fun with signage in the stairwells to make it more interesting, that people could have something to read while they were going up and down the stairs, just make it a little more of an event rather than just a must-do. So I think it's finding that balance to help people, feel good about trying to keep everybody safe.
Yeah, that's a great point. Maybe some encouragement to use those other paths like the signage in areas or the different decorations in areas that maybe encourage people to take a different path than normal. And again, communication is a big piece here to make sure that people understand what the plan is for the building. Improve air quality. There's been a lot of discussions about how HVAC systems may or may not spread in specifically COVID-19 virus. And more studies will come out, and so there is an air quality piece. And in analyzing how you address this in your building, step number one is what type of system do you have? Is it heat only? Is it water, hydronic system, or air? Heat and air conditioning, is it combined or separate for the spaces? Or is it combined and separate for the heat and air conditioning systems? For heat-only buildings, the use of operable windows should be encouraged, and even putting together a plan for that and communicating it. Do you have mechanical ventilation? Lots of buildings that have been renovated or the HVAC system has been put into place in the last 10 or 15 years have mechanical ventilation. And by code, that's required in any newer buildings. So do you have it, and can you increase the outdoor air ventilation? What type of control system do you have? There are as many control systems as there are buildings and HVAC systems, and so specifically taking a look at your control system, even something as simple as increasing fan speed or increasing the use and operable time of fans can be increased in the amount of time a day it's used to help increase ventilation in the building. And know your options. Buildings naturally breathe. They are designed to naturally breathe. A term out there that is a fairly common industry term is ACH, or air changes per hour. For older buildings, the air changes per hour may be quite high, and that's because of construction and the way it was built. It's less energy efficient, but in this case, it's a healthier situation. Typical air changes per hour are between 4 and 6, and as buildings are built now, that is getting to be a lower requirement by code because of energy efficiency. But if you have an air change of 4 to 6 per hour at this point in time, you might not be able to increase it. So it is, if it's lower, how can you improve? How can you get more outside air into the building to flush the building, so to speak? The other item worth bringing up is that, does your building operate at a positive or negative pressure? Many designs in the last few years have been designed, their control systems have been designed to operate buildings at a positive pressure. And what that means is that the inside pressure is greater than the outside pressure. That was done for lots of great energy efficient reasons. You would want to decrease the amount of unwanted air infiltration. And so if you pressurize your building on a positive pressure, then you would be pushing basically air out through all of those cracks. But now we're talking about maybe that's not a great situation, because what you're doing is you're pushing air from one space into another space, interior, and that crossover may not be a good thing. So are there places that you can change the pressure in your building spaces? And again, this is not anything that you can feel, but it's just enough to move air differently so that you are not having cross-contamination into spaces. So you may need to take a look at the control system to see if that needs to change. So you can look for areas to dilute the air to increase the air quality. So how would you dilute it? You'd increase the outside air, opening dampers, eliminating recirculation. So opening dampers, there's a set point of your dampers if you have outdoor air that is designed to come into the building, and you can increase their openings to increase the amount of air that comes in. A lot of systems, air systems, recirculate the air. So there's a portion of air that gets recirculated, and then there's a portion that gets exhausted. And again, for lots of great energy efficient reasons, people would rather be heating warm air or cooling cool air to increase energy efficiency. So a lot of those recirculation paths are pretty heavy. It would be worth it to look at if you have recirculation and areas to eliminate it or reduce it and increase the amount of outside air that comes in instead. Can you flush the building? So flushing the building is a term that's being referred to as increasing the number of air changes per hour before you have anybody occupy it. Can you flush the building at night, increase your fan speeds, increase your ventilation so that the next morning the building has a good turnover of outside air? Can you do that on a regular basis? Do you have operable windows? Operable windows are great in this case in establishing a schedule to keep them open when weather permits. Maybe something that will help with increasing the indoor air quality. Can you keep the restroom fans running during occupied hours? This is an important piece, and again, having to do with pressurizing. Those bathrooms have been designed to have a negative pressure to begin with. So when you turn your bathroom vent fans on and keep them on during occupied hours, then it is already designed to be creating a negative pressure in that space. And all of that air goes to the outside, so none of the air that gets pulled out of the bathrooms gets recirculated back into the system. Another thing to consider is the air shared? So when you have multiple tenants in a building, is there any shared air in those spaces, or do they have independent systems?
And Rebecca, I'll just jump in here on a couple of thoughts on that too, but this is just going back to something Rebecca said right at the beginning. I mean, every building is different and every system is different, and I think our objective with these notes that we've been putting up on the screen is to really challenge folks to stop and think about their building. I mean, having been a building, or not been, I am a building owner, and some of these questions you raise, it comes up with, gosh, do I even know what the systems are in my building? And of course they vary with age and they vary with system type, but this is a good opportunity to get that HVAC or mechanical technician out there and spend some time actually learning the systems in your building, not just getting regular maintenance done, but also learning the systems and find out what the options are. You might be surprised that there's more options than you think when it comes to improving the air quality in the buildings. We'll be getting to a few more of those here shortly, but just keep going back to that notion that let's start with understanding what you've got. Because another thing that Rebecca and I have learned in this whole process is that on a scale of what's most important, the HVAC systems are kind of a ways down on the scale. The most important stuff is going to be social distancing and keeping contact surfaces clean and things like that. But that system in your building is still an important part of the total puzzle that we're wrestling with here, and getting a good inventory of what you've got to start with is important, because in some cases you may have wonderful opportunities. In other cases you may just have an older building with very few options. But either way, once you have a better understanding, then you can go from there.
The other, when we talk about diluting air, and Alan has a great point that there are some other social distancing and disinfecting surfaces have found to be the most effective in slowing or mitigating the spread of COVID-19. The HVAC system is down on the list. But at the same time, the other thing that comes up here, especially when we start talking about diluting air, is and I've referred to it a couple different times, in that there's been an energy efficiency push the last few years to increase energy efficiency. So a lot of systems have been put into place to increase energy efficiency. And in such as recirculating air or damper positions, all of those choices were made, again, to increase efficiency of the system. Because 40 years ago, we had very, very inefficient HVAC systems. And so how does all of this compare with energy efficiency? Well, ASHRAE as well as Energy Star have done some research already, and what they even call, back of the napkin type of calculations at this point, that making some of these changes is not going to significantly decrease the efficiency. And the numbers that they're using right now talk about there could be a 3 to 5% increase in energy use to do some of these things. So there is a cost associated to it, but it's not huge, and it's certainly reasonable to help with the benefits that it provides for mitigating the spread of the virus. So in addition to diluting the air, there are areas to improve filtration. Can you keep the circulation fans running 100% of the time? So the air goes through the filters, and if you can keep the system running, you are going to increase the amount of air that goes through the filters. What type of filters does your system have? I think a lot of us who have been involved in the building industry, even just the past couple months, have started hearing a lot about MERV 13 filters. And MERV 13 would be the minimum filter requirement, or not requirement, recommendation for buildings. And in addition to MERV 13, to certainly be up to replacing the filters at least quarterly, and even more often for areas of high traffic or high volume. Inspect the ductwork for leaks and filter bypass. The other interesting thing that I recently learned is the studies about filter bypass are significant. Even just a half an inch around a bypass around a filter can actually reduce the amount of filtration by 25% through the filter. So I'll say that again, a half an inch around the outside of your filter is creating enough airflow around it to make it so 25% of the air isn't going through the filter, it's going around. So, inspecting the ductwork for leaks and filter bypass could be a significant piece.
And just to add also, Rebecca, to the MERV 13 reference for filters, I've done some checking because we made those conversions here in our building, and the lower standards, which have been the more common, I think MERV 5, MERV 6, something like that, the physical size of those two filters in terms of replacement, they're virtually the same, so there's really no problem with replacing, and the general impact on airflow is minimal as well, so it doesn't require a lot of rebalancing. In other words, they're a little more expensive to install the MERV 13, but they're otherwise relatively easy to install. I think it took us, we did about 10 filters here in this building with the technician here, and I think it took us all of half an hour to 45 minutes to replace them all. So it's a pretty simple conversion.
And what does, for those of us who maybe are not as familiar with what MERV 13 means, there is MERV 8, which is a very common filter rating in a lot of buildings. MERV 13 is a better quality. If we go up, increasing quality, a lot of us have heard of HEPA filters. The MERV 8, for instance, with COVID-19, it's about 0.125 micron nuclei, and the MERV 8 won't catch that size. I will say that this COVID-19 virus does attach itself to bigger particles too, so the MERV 8 filter could be catching some of them when they're attached to bigger particles. The MERV 13 will catch 50% of particles that size that are similar to the COVID-19 virus. The HEPA filters capture up to 89% of particles of that size. So just to give everyone a little bit of relationship value of what MERV 13 means. The other thing we have to note when we're talking about it is that anybody who is working on any of the equipment now, replacing filters, they should use personal protective equipment because they could potentially be handling contaminated substances, and to properly contain those disposed materials. So for air quality, improving air quality, develop a plan for improving the air quality, and that's going to be very specific to a specific building. Communicate it with the tenants and the occupants. Circulate a detailed memo. Post signs. Be proactive about how you're communicating that, because lots of people at this point are very concerned and nervous about getting back into these buildings. So when you provide signage, identify those modifications, demonstrate that good faith effort, and demonstrate that the safety of the building users is your high priority. Because it's important to provide a safe environment in a coronavirus world. There are lots of speculation that we could go in and out of this situation as far as high impact areas for a while. So if you understand where you're starting with your building, then it allows you to make those informed decisions about what to do with it. And implement the thoughtful programs and communicate them with the building users. So in summary, again, sanitation and disinfecting, coordinating that with your tenants, it has been found that is the highest, the most useful method in preventing the spread of COVID-19. When it comes to social distancing, figure out where you can manage that traffic flow in the building, and especially in narrow hallways and elevators. Establish occupant density levels and communicate it with your building occupants. You want to dilute and filter the air. So in the dilution of air, increase the outdoor air that dilutes the indoor air. Keep the air systems running. don't turn down the systems. Lots of control systems are set up to turn them down, turn those fan speeds down at night or when there are fewer people in the building. And so keep them running. Keep the restrooms ventilated with mechanical ventilation. Inspect heat recovery equipment to make sure that the leakages are under control. So heat recovery equipment would be part of if you have outdoor air coming in. Avoid recirculation of your air systems and encourage the use of operable windows. Filtering the air, replace the filters more frequently. Inspect and prevent filter bypass. And install the MERV 13 filters if possible. Every building is different and offers very unique opportunities, and some are more limited than others. So start with what you know and learn about your building, and then put a plan in place for your good faith effort to increase that air quality and provide the social distancing and provide the disinfected surfaces. And that's about all we had. I do see one of the questions. Have any standards been set up for cleaning and disinfecting? And what is the fogging process for sanitized? And are there best practices established? So, Alan, if you have something in here that certainly feel free to jump in. Have there been standards set up for cleaning and disinfecting? I think that lots of organizations are in the process of providing some information. In a lot of ways, I feel like we have been really hit hard about cleaning and disinfecting. And as you know, we're only a couple months into this, so a lot of organizations have not had the opportunity to put a lot of information together. But I think that they're developing them. And I haven't seen any checklists like I have seen for other things yet. Alan, do you know of any standards that have been set up?
Just more recommendations, more guidelines. It's really not any official standards. I mean, I think everybody, like you said, this is, we're plowing new ground. I mean, we're trying to be thorough. The organizations that are out there, whether it's, the commercial property managers, there's a couple of specific larger national property management companies that have issued recommendations that are pretty comprehensive, but they're not really what I would call a standard. I mean, they basically are taking everything that you can think of and basically saying, you should be doing that. I think the notion of a lot of it comes back to the condition and age and configuration of your building, and also the occupant density. One of the things that shows up in a lot of these standards or guidelines is the frequency that you would be cleaning surfaces, and that you might have somebody assigned on the staff of the building management to be cleaning surfaces, and the frequency of that's going to depend on the number of people in the building. I mean, in some cases, I've seen that certain surfaces, in hallways and entryways and lobbies and things like that, would be wiped down on an hourly basis, with an appropriate disinfectant. And there's different standards out there about, most of them all seem to settle on the notion that, some sort of an alcohol-based disinfectant, 80% or better, I think, is the most common standard, is probably the best, but there are other alternatives to that as well. But the frequency shows up a lot, and I think, but then again, I think that's driven by, what is the occupancy and what is the use of that particular part of the building. So, and that runs to, restrooms and what people do for themselves in and out of restrooms, and of course what other people would do as the property management. Another thing that's showing up is the notion of having having distance monitors. I mean, I was seeing that in the media just recently that, more companies and more building owners, and particularly in some of the retail markets and even the more densely populated commercial buildings where you've got big lobbies and things like that with a lot of people flowing through the lobbies, that, that you establish someone who is their responsibility is to try to do their best to maintain distance or encourage people to maintain distances. I mean, I think, as Rebecca said, this is all, it's such new ground, and we're really learning as we go, what works and doesn't work. I mean, it wasn't but a few weeks ago or a month ago that, the notion of wearing masks was sort of a new idea. Now it's being recommended as really maybe the best way to prevent, transfer of the virus over and above even some of the other social distancing and things like that. So we're learning every day, and but those are the kind of standards that I'm seeing, coming up. It's cleaning surfaces, the frequency of cleaning, and also actually managing people as it relates to social distancing.
And the next question about fogging process. So the fogging process for sanitizing, fogging has been found that it's not that effective right now on surfaces. What fogging does is it puts a fog in the air that attaches itself to particles in the air which may have COVID-19 on them, and it makes them very heavy so they fall to the floor. So it is a way to provide some extra methods for, shall we say, air decontamination in specific areas. But I think there's still, haven't seen any good evidence at this point that it's effective, or other than, again, just sort of normal routine of disinfecting surfaces is something that is still the highest priority. Let's see, what else do we have for questions here? How much time would it take to address the major recommendations? And how do you know if you've implemented them correctly? Those are good questions too. How much time does it take? Well, I think it depends on your building. If you have people who are already familiar with the operation of your building, whether or not it's the people flow or the HVAC air filtration piece, as Alan had mentioned earlier, whoever services your mechanical system, your HVAC system, would be a good place to start. And then how much time does it take? It really depends on your building, its usage, and the flow of people through it. How do you know if you've implemented them correctly? Well, I'm not sure that we know that for sure. I think when you are setting up your communication, then communicating to each of your tenants about what you're doing, having them communicate what they're doing, because they are likely doing some disinfecting of their surfaces, and just keeping track of it to make sure that everybody is collective in their efforts and understand what everyone else is doing.
Well, and just to add to that a little bit, Rebecca, and basically agreeing with what you said, but I think that, the notion, if you're in a multi-tenant building like we have here, for example, and coordinating with the other tenants to know what they're doing within their own space and to share with them what you're doing for the common areas of the building. I mean, that runs to the signage and good communication that we've talked about before. And, those signs don't have to be super professional. You don't have to spend a lot of money on them. You can, Word documents are easy to post and gets the word out in terms of what's being done, along with the memos and things like that. But the time that's involved, and well, two things. One, the time involved is, as you said, very dependent on the building and the building systems. I mean, what we did in this building, which has about 8 tenants and about 22,000 square feet on 2 floors. With the mechanical technicians that we had involved in making some modifications to the way the system works, and adding the filters, that was a few hours. I mean, it wasn't really a big project. I do think, though, another piece of that is the confirming what work has been done. As I said before, it's important if you own the building or if you're managing the building or if you're a primary occupant in the building, get a little more hands-on. Make sure that, you don't just tell the mechanical service people to say, well, improve the ventilation. You need to be more specific than that and get records of that. Not that anybody's going to be deliberately misleading in anything that they would do, but at the same time, we're still plowing new ground. And if you want to be more specific about exactly what do you mean by improving the ventilation, and then make sure that you're getting confirmation in some sort of a work order or something back from the technicians to confirm that that actually has been done. I think that's all important, just so if for no other reason, but so that everybody can feel comfortable that what's needed has been done.
Great points, Ellen. Another question here, our thoughts about recommissioning buildings that have been shut down for a few months. And the New York Times article mentioning some concern about Legionnaire's disease in the water. And that is, I think we talked about that just a phrase or two at the beginning of the slides, that is definitely something to be concerned about. There is potentially, especially if you are changing filters and upgrading filters from like a MERV 8 to a MERV 13 or higher, there will definitely be a need to recommission the buildings, because the filters that filter more particles tend to create a bigger pressure drop in the system, and you may not have enough airflow in the system because of that. So there is a need to recommission buildings where a lot of those items need to be upgraded. And as far as the Legionnaire's disease, yes, buildings that have had no flow of water through them, certainly there's a need to flush those piping systems out, and get them moving so that you have fresh water in them, and it hasn't been sitting around collecting bacteria, which creates the Legionnaire's disease. Filters, another question about air filters, electronic air purifiers or cleaners that are built into the system. There has been a lot of renewed conversation about UV filters and ultraviolet irradiation, and actually it's ultraviolet germicidal radiation, and that is something to consider. They are effective, but there are some limitations on them. There are some limitations on where they are located for them to be effective. They also are less effective with the higher speed airflow. So the answer to that is that, yes, there's a reason to consider those things, but they need to be thoughtfully placed so that they are the most effective, because they can be placed in areas where they're not effective at all, and they are fairly high cost to do that. Does adding intake filtration, is it recommended, and does spraying filters daily with alcohol disinfectants affect filter effectiveness? So intake filtration is not recommended if there's an airborne virus. It's probably originating from inside the building, probably not outside the building. So the intake filters are not recommended. Spraying filters with anything is also generally not recommended unless it's specifically approved by the filter manufacturer. Spraying filters with alcohol or other disinfectants can break down the filter and actually make them less effective. They're good for so many minutes after you first do it, but then they become less effective and they start breaking down the filter. So eventually, very quickly, it becomes less effective than the filter was originally. And then the question about air ionization and UV systems. those, again, those can be effective as long as they are put in the right places. There are lots of air filters, I think, that we may be seeing, individual ones that show up on people's desks and so forth. And those are effective, but they are not, somebody leaves the space where that, ionization or purifier is, and they move into a space that could potentially be contaminated. So it's better to address the building holistically and do your best as a building owner or building operator to make all the spaces clean as well as you can. And if there are individual spaces that may need extra purification, those can be done. But a lot of those devices, like I said, are for one specific area. All right. I think there are no more questions. We thank you all. If you have, if anything comes up, you want to touch base with us, certainly get a hold of us, myself or Alan, and we will also be posting this on our website. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions.